The atmosphere in the room was charged, the tension palpable. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the fiery young congresswoman from New York, stood at the podium, her voice cutting through the air. She'd been known for her sharp words, but today, she was about to take aim at someone unexpected, U.S. Senator John Neely Kennedy. With a sneer, AOC turned her attention to the seasoned politician, known for his southern drawl and deep legal knowledge. "I mean, come on, Senator Kennedy, you've got a law degree, but how relevant is that today? Your education is as outdated as your ideas," she said, her words dripping with mockery. The audience shifted uncomfortably. It was a bold move, attacking a man who'd spent decades in law, rising through the ranks of the Senate. The crowd was waiting, wondering how he would react. Would he back down, or would he retaliate? The clock was ticking, the stage set for a showdown. Senator Kennedy stood motionless for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if calculating his next move. The room held its breath. Little did AOC know Kennedy was about to do something no one saw coming. John Neely Kennedy was not a man easily rattled. As a U.S. Senator, he had faced off against the sharpest minds in Washington. He had debated, on the Senate floor, swayed public opinion with his calculated words, and earned a reputation for being unafraid to speak his mind. Yet here he was, standing in the spotlight of a heated debate with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a young congresswoman who had captured the hearts of many with her fiery rhetoric and unapologetic stance on progressive issues. Kennedy, however, was no stranger to controversy. His folksy charm and slow Southern drawl had made him a target for critics who saw him as an out-of-touch relic from another era. But what they didn't realize was that beneath that calm exterior was a razor-sharp intellect and an iron will, honed over decades in law and politics. As AOC's words echoed through the chamber, the audience waited for the senator's response. They had seen him deliver impassioned speeches, but this was different. This wasn't about policy or politics, this was personal. AOC had questioned his education, something Kennedy valued deeply. Outdated, he thought, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. He had fought too hard for his law degree, spent too many years working tirelessly in the courtroom to let her mock it so easily. But Kennedy wasn't the type to snap back with an emotional outburst. He had learned over the years that the most effective way to deal with a challenge was to meet it head-on, with calm precision. The silence in the room stretched, the tension mounting with every passing second. AOC had made her point, but now it was time for Kennedy to make his. He took a step forward, adjusting the microphone in front of him. His voice, when he spoke, was measured, calm, but there was an underlying power to it, a promise that whatever came next would not be easily forgotten. "Senator Kennedy," AOC continued, not backing down, "you've got a law degree, but it's obvious your approach to politics is stuck in the past. Maybe you should take a step back and let someone more forward-thinking lead." Her tone was laced with sarcasm, but the crowd was listening intently, sensing the clash of ideologies. Kennedy could feel the weight of her words, but instead of rising to the bait, he remained composed. He knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about sending a message. It was about showing that despite all the noise, experience and wisdom still had value in today's world. He leaned into the microphone, his eyes scanning the room, his gaze briefly catching AOC's before he turned his attention to the audience. The crowd had quieted, hanging on his every word. And then, with a slight smile that suggested he had been waiting for this very moment, he spoke. His words, slow and deliberate, carried the weight of years of experience, the kind of experience that couldn't be mocked away by a few snide comments. "I may have a law degree, but at least I didn't go to a school where the tuition is higher than your IQ," Kennedy said, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable bite. The room went dead silent. For a brief second, it seemed as though the air had thickened, as if the words themselves had weight. AOC froze, her smile faltering for the first time. Kennedy had caught her off guard, and the impact was immediate. The crowd, stunned at first, erupted into shocked laughter and applause. Even those who hadn't supported Kennedy in the past couldn't help but acknowledge the perfect timing of his comeback. AOC stood there, visibly rattled, her composure slipping as she searched for a retort. But the damage had already been done. Kennedy had not only shut down her mockery, he had turned the tables in a way that left her with no room to recover. The crowd's reaction was deafening, but Kennedy remained calm, his demeanor unchanged. He had won this round, and it was clear that AOC had underestimated the power of experience and the art of the perfect retort. The tension in the room was palpable. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, known for her quick wit and fiery speeches, had just been caught off guard by a response that was as sharp as it was unexpected. For a brief moment, her confident smile faltered. The crowd had been waiting for her to lash back for some sort of sharp retort, but it never came. Instead, she stood there, eyes narrowing slightly, trying to recover from Kennedy's biting comment. The cameras flashed as the audience buzzed with excitement. Social media was already lighting up with hashtags like Kennedy crushes AOC and Senator Shutdown. But AOC wasn't about to go down without a fight. Her mind was racing, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just about winning a political debate. It was about saving face, about ensuring that she wasn't seen as weak or unprepared. She had tried to use Kennedy's law degree against him, but now it seemed as if she had underestimated the very thing she'd mocked. Kennedy wasn't the type to engage in petty insults or emotional outbursts. He knew how to make a point, how to use his experience and wit to outmaneuver his opponents, and that's exactly what he had done. AOC clenched her jaw, stepping forward slightly, her eyes locked onto Kennedy. There was no backing down now. This was no longer just about a debate. It had become a battle of wills. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice colder now, trying to regain control of the conversation. "I didn't come here to talk about your outdated degree. I came here to talk about what this country needs. Real progressive change. We can't keep clinging to the past and expect to move forward." The audience was still buzzing, but Kennedy remained calm, unfazed by the change in her tone. He knew exactly what she was trying to do: divert the attention away from his comeback and back onto the issue at hand. But Kennedy wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. "Real progressive change?" he said, his voice cool but tinged with amusement. "Let me tell you something, young lady. Change doesn't come from ignoring the past. You can't just throw away decades of knowledge, of hard work, and think that's progress. Progress comes from learning from what came before and building on it. You can't reinvent the wheel every time you need a ride." Kennedy's words struck at the core of the issue. It wasn't about progressive or conservative ideals. It was about the value of experience. AOC had built her reputation on challenging the status quo, but Kennedy was challenging her very understanding of what it meant to truly drive change. AOC took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to keep her composure. She had to find a way to fight back. But this time she couldn't rely on her usual tactics. She couldn't just dismiss him as an out-of-touch politician. Kennedy wasn't just some old relic. He was a man who had proven his worth, who had achieved things that she could only hope to accomplish in the future. "Senator," AOC began, her voice softer now, but still carrying the weight of defiance. "You may think you have all the answers, but the world is changing. And if we don't start thinking outside the box, we're going to be left behind." Kennedy tilted his head slightly as though considering her words. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger, but understanding. He knew where she was coming from. He knew that she was trying to make a point, but the problem was, she was doing it the wrong way. Change wasn't about ignoring the lessons of the past. It was about building on them, making them work for the future, and that was where he was about to make his move. "Thinking outside the box, huh?" Kennedy said, raising an eyebrow. "Well, I've got a box of experience, and it's worked pretty well for me so far. I've seen what happens when you ignore the box, when you think you can reinvent everything without considering what's come before. You end up lost. That's not change, that's chaos." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over the crowd like a thick fog. This wasn't just a debate anymore. This was a battle of ideas, a clash of generations, and Kennedy was holding his ground. He wasn't just defending his law degree or his past. He was defending the very idea of progress. AOC's face hardened, her eyes flashing with frustration. She had come into this debate with a plan, with the belief that she could easily tear down Kennedy's reputation and experience. But now, she found herself on the defensive. She had underestimated him, and it was becoming clear that Kennedy wasn't going to let her get away with it. But just as she was about to respond, Kennedy did something unexpected. He took a step closer to the microphone, his expression shifting from one of calm confidence to something more playful. His eyes sparkled with mischief, and there was a momentary glint of humor in his voice as he spoke again. "You know, I may be outdated by your standards, but at least I know how to win a case in the courtroom. I may not have your Twitter following, but I've got something you'll never get from a hashtag: experience." And with that, Kennedy leaned back, his hands resting casually on the podium. The crowd erupted into laughter and applause, the energy in the room shifting once more. It was clear who had won this round. Kennedy had used AOC's own words against her, turning her mockery into a moment of triumph. AOC stood there, stunned, her mouth slightly agape as the audience reacted. She hadn't expected that, and neither had anyone else. Kennedy's quick thinking and sharp response had not only shut down her attack, but it had left her scrambling for words. She wasn't the only one who could deliver a knockout punch. The crowd's reaction was deafening. AOC had been put in her place, and Kennedy had done it with a single, perfectly timed sentence. The debate was far from over, but for now it was clear. Kennedy had emerged victorious. The room was buzzing with energy, the echoes of Kennedy's sharp retort still reverberating off the walls. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood there for a long moment, her posture stiffening as the shock of the moment settled in. It wasn't just the crowd's response. It was the unmistakable realization that Kennedy had outmaneuvered her at her own game. He hadn't just refuted her words. He had turned them into a moment of undeniable power. He had made his experience, his background, his very presence a weapon. AOC stood silent for a heartbeat, eyes scanning the crowd. They were on his side now. The energy in the room had shifted in Kennedy's favor, the mocking tone of her earlier words now lost in the silence that followed. A few moments passed before she could bring herself to speak again. But even as she opened her mouth, Kennedy wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let this be a moment of fleeting triumph. As the room waited for AOC's comeback, Kennedy's calm voice cut through the air, steady and authoritative, but with a touch of humor that only seemed to heighten his control of the situation. "Look, I get it," Kennedy began, his voice still warm, but with that signature, unshakable confidence. "You're young, and you want to make waves. You want to change the world. Hell, I admire that. But there's one thing you're forgetting, Alexandria. Change doesn't come from tearing everything down. It comes from building something better. And you can't do that if you don't respect what came before." The words hung in the air, like a challenge, but also an invitation. Kennedy wasn't simply defending himself or his past. He was issuing a challenge to AOC, to the crowd, to the political world at large. Change could be achieved, yes, but only by understanding history, respecting it, and using it to build a better future. AOC's frustration was palpable. She was a political outsider, an outsider to the established norms of Washington. And Kennedy's steady demeanor was the very thing she had been fighting against. How could she respond? How could she continue her attack when the crowd had already turned? She had underestimated him, and now it was clear that Kennedy wasn't just playing the game. He had set the rules. Her eyes darted back and forth, her mind racing to formulate a response. But the harder she tried to regain control, the more she realized she was losing the battle. The damage had been done. Kennedy had masterfully deflected her barbs, and now he was reminding everyone, including her, that wisdom and experience had their own value. The crowd had shifted. They weren't just laughing at Kennedy's one-liner anymore. They were respecting him. His quiet yet powerful delivery had made it clear experience wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. He wasn't just the older politician in the room. He was the one who had learned from his mistakes, who had made decisions that impacted lives, who had proven himself time and time again. And in that moment he had made AOC's challenge seem naive, dismissing her attack with the precision of a seasoned debater. Kennedy could see the gears turning in AOC's mind. She had nothing left to say. She couldn't win this round. So she did what many in her position would do. She tried to pivot, to take the conversation back to what mattered to her. But Kennedy wasn't having it. He leaned in closer to the microphone, and for a split second the room seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. "You know," Kennedy continued, his tone shifting slightly, softer now but still firm. "There's a lot of talk about how we're going to change the world. A lot of folks claim they have the answers. But the truth is, those of us who have been around a little longer know something the young ones don't. Change takes time. Real change takes patience, and sometimes the answer isn't in what you tear down, it's in what you build up." This time the applause was louder. It wasn't the applause of a punchline or a clever retort. It was the applause of respect, the kind you give to someone who's been there, done that, and lived to tell the story. Kennedy had not only survived the onslaught of mockery from AOC, he had come out on top, not by shouting or by dominating, with rhetoric, but by simply standing his ground. AOC stood there visibly deflated. She had fought so hard to prove herself, to prove that she was the future, that her ideals were the ones that would lead the country forward. But Kennedy had just shown her that the future couldn't be built by dismissing the past. And in front of an entire room, she had just been outclassed by a man whose wisdom, whose experience, whose steady hand had proven more valuable than any quick soundbite or viral tweet. The tension that had once filled the air had now dissipated, replaced by a quieter, more contemplative energy. Kennedy had won, not just by his words, but by embodying everything AOC had mocked. He had shown that experience wasn't just something to be proud of. It was something to be wielded carefully and with purpose. As the debate wound down, it was clear who had taken the lead. Kennedy had won the moment, but more than that, he had reminded everyone, both in the room and watching, at home, that experience and wisdom had their place in politics. And it wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. When it was over and the microphones were switched off, Kennedy walked over to AOC with a calm smile. "It's all about learning from the past, Alexandria. If you keep an open mind, you'll see it too." AOC's lips tightened into a thin smile, but there was no denying it. Kennedy had shown her that there was a lot more to politics than simply breaking things apart. And in that moment, perhaps, she realized that the true power of change came, not from tearing down, but from building up slowly, with purpose. The debate was over, but the lingering effects of that final exchange would reverberate for days. As the audience slowly filed out of the room, the murmur of conversation filled the air, but the conversations were different now. People weren't just discussing the topics at hand. They were talking about the performance, the back and forth, and more than anything, Kennedy's ability to turn what seemed like an attack into a moment of undeniable victory. Kennedy stood at the back of the stage, taking a moment to catch his breath, a quiet smile on his face. He had been through far more difficult political battles in his time, but there was something uniquely satisfying about this one. It wasn't about policy or power or pushing an agenda. It was about showing that wisdom, experience, and careful thought still had a place in the modern world of quick tweets and instant opinions. It was about proving that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was stand still, remain calm, and let your words land precisely where they were needed. AOC, on the other hand, was left in the wings, surrounded by her aides and a few lingering supporters. She had hoped to make a statement, to show that the new generation of politicians had the answers to the world's problems. And in her mind, that meant undermining the old guard, making it clear that their time was over. But Kennedy's retort, his calm composure and his carefully chosen words had left her with no room to maneuver. She hadn't expected him to hit back so hard. She hadn't expected him to use her own tactics against her, and in such a devastatingly effective way. It was a hard lesson for AOC, but perhaps one she needed to learn. The world didn't always operate in the flashy viral moments that dominated social media. Sometimes it was the steady, thoughtful voices that carried the most weight. And in this moment, Kennedy had shown that experience wasn't just about knowing the answers. It was about understanding when to speak and when to remain silent, when to push forward and when to let your opponent tire themselves out. In the days that followed, the story of the debate continued to make waves. Clips from the exchange flooded social media, with commentators and pundits dissecting Kennedy's comeback. Some admired his poise, while others saw it as another example of the older generation trying to maintain control. But no one could deny that Kennedy had dominated the moment. The hashtags #Kennedy wins and #AOC defeated spread like wildfire, and news outlets covered the event with a sense of awe at Kennedy's ability to handle the situation. Meanwhile, in her office, AOC was reviewing the footage, her brow furrowed in thought. She had spent years building her brand as the voice of change, the one who could challenge the establishment and win, but today, she had been schooled in something she hadn't expected: the value of taking a step back, of considering the long view, of understanding the subtleties of power. She wasn't giving up on her ideals. She wasn't going to stop fighting for what she believed in. But today had shown her that there were more ways to fight than just charging forward. Sometimes a single sentence, well-timed, well-delivered, could do more than any speech or protest. It could change the course of a conversation, win respect, and ultimately prove that experience mattered. AOC knew she had lost the battle, but in her defeat, she realized she had learned something important. She had learned that wisdom was earned, not just claimed. She had learned that you couldn't challenge something you didn't understand. And most importantly, she had learned that experience, when wielded correctly, could crush the most clever of challenges. Kennedy's victory wasn't just about the debate. It was about a bigger message: that experience, history, and the lessons learned from years of hard work had value in a world that often seemed obsessed with the new, the flashy, and the immediate. In a society that had become increasingly impatient, Kennedy had reminded everyone that some things couldn't be rushed. The change didn't always come in the form of viral moments or quick wins. Sometimes it came from steady determination and the courage to stand by your convictions. As the media buzzed, Kennedy's staff began fielding calls for interviews, radio spots, and even invitations for him to speak at various events. But Kennedy wasn't interested in the spotlight. He didn't need the attention. For him, it was never about proving that he was better than anyone else. It was about showing that the work, the effort, and the wisdom that had been gained through experience still had value. That message, for him, was enough. Later that evening, Kennedy sat at his desk in his office, his mind drifting to the many debates he had been a part of in the past. He had faced politicians more powerful than AOC, more experienced and far more dangerous. Yet, it was moments like this, moments when he could distill the essence of his beliefs into a few simple words, that reminded him of why he had chosen to enter politics in the first place. He thought of the people he had met over the years, the communities he had helped, and the countless cases he had worked on in the courtroom. It wasn't just about winning arguments or making headlines. It was about making a difference, no matter how small, no matter how slow the progress. It was about using his experience to help those who needed it most. And as he sat there, reflecting on the events of the day, Kennedy smiled to himself. The debate had been over, but the lesson was clear. No matter how loud the voices of the young and the brash became, there would always be a place for those who had earned their wisdom through hard work and perseverance. The world had changed, but some things, like experience, wisdom, and the power of a well-timed word, would never go out of style. The day after the debate, the media frenzy surrounding Kennedy's victorious one-liner continued to intensify. News outlets across the country were dissecting the moment in minute detail. Pundits on both sides of the political spectrum had weighed in, some admiring Kennedy's calm and wisdom, while others criticized him for being stuck in the past. But in the midst of all the media noise, Kennedy wasn't paying much attention. He was used to the headlines, the speculation, and the sensationalism. What mattered to him now was the reaction from the people he represented, As a senator, his job wasn't to win Twitter battles or outshine his opponents in the media. It was to serve the people of Louisiana, to ensure their voices were heard, and to make decisions that would improve their lives. And in that regard, Kennedy had made a choice. He wasn't going to be a politician who won popularity contests. He was going to be the one who made sure that every decision he made was grounded in something more enduring: experience, humility, and the belief that real change came from understanding where you'd been. But as Kennedy went about his day, attending meetings, reviewing bills, and dealing with his regular Senate duties, there was one person who couldn't get the debate off her mind: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. AOC's office had been flooded with messages ever since the debate, and not just from her supporters. The backlash was intense. Critics from across the country were quick to use Kennedy's response as a symbol of everything wrong with her approach: that she was too quick to dismiss others, too eager to tear down the establishment, and too unwilling to respect the value of experience. And the comments weren't limited to the media. Even some of her fellow Democrats privately expressed concerns. While AOC had become a lightning rod for progressive ideals, there were many who saw her approach as a little too brash, a little too hasty. But the criticism didn't stop there. Some saw Kennedy's victory as a larger metaphor for the generational divide in American politics. AOC had come to represent the future, bold, brash, and ready to challenge the status quo. Kennedy, on the other hand, had come to represent the past, seasoned, thoughtful, and steady. It wasn't just a personal clash. It was a symbolic battle between two ways of thinking, two ways of governing. AOC, however, was not one to back down easily. Her political journey had been defined by resilience, by pushing forward against overwhelming odds. She had come into politics as an outsider, a disruptor, and she wasn't about to let one setback define her. In the quiet of her office, she sat back in her chair, staring out the window at the city below. Her phone was filled with messages, some supportive, some critical, but it wasn't the messages that weighed on her. It was the sense that for the first time in her career, she had underestimated her opponent. Kennedy had been a challenge, but not because he was the old guard or because he represented everything she was fighting against. No, Kennedy had been a challenge because he had seen what she was trying to do before, and he had outsmarted her. In the silence of her office, she replayed the debate over and over again in her mind. Kennedy's words were still fresh, his calm confidence cutting through the noise of her own thoughts. How could she have allowed him to get the last word? How could she have let him make her look like a novice when she had spent so much of her career proving that she wasn't? As much as she wanted to shake off the defeat, there was something deep inside her that knew she couldn't. AOC had spent her whole career pushing for change, challenging the establishment, and never backing down. But in this moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about always charging ahead. Maybe sometimes the fight was about knowing when to step back, to listen, to learn, and to use experience as a tool, not just something to discard. Over the next few days, AOC began reflecting on the lessons of that debate. While she still believed in her vision for a better future, she understood now that the way forward wasn't as simple as pushing against the old guard. It was about finding a way to bridge the gap between new ideas and the wisdom of the past. Experience was not something to mock or discard. It was something that could be used to inform and enrich the path forward. For Kennedy, the aftermath of the debate was far quieter. He had done what he had set out to do, not to embarrass AOC, but to make a point about the value of experience in an era that seemed to value speed over depth. He knew that politics was about more than just winning a debate or getting a viral moment. It was about working for the people, making decisions that would affect generations to come. The attention was flattering, but he didn't need it. He had already won in the only way that mattered, by standing firm in his beliefs. Kennedy's victory wasn't just about silencing AOC's mockery. It was about reaffirming the idea that politics wasn't just a game of sound bites and one-liners. It was a battle of ideas, yes, but also a battle of values. And in that battle, Kennedy had proven that wisdom, grounded in experience, still had a place. But Kennedy knew that his victory was not complete. The next step was to ensure that his victory wasn't just a win over AOC. It was a victory for those who believed in the power of experience, for those who wanted a leader who could see beyond the headlines and the noise. The real challenge lay ahead in proving that experience wasn't just a relic of the past, but a necessary ingredient for the future. In the end, both Kennedy and AOC had learned something important that day. Kennedy had reminded the world that experience, when wielded properly, could be a weapon. AOC had learned that change could not come from just tearing things down. Sometimes, it was about understanding and respecting the lessons of the past, building on them to create something better. As the days passed, the echoes of the debate slowly faded. But the lessons they learned and the respect they had for each other would remain. And while the world may have moved on to the next viral moment, the lesson of that debate was clear. In the battle for the future, the past would always have a place. The weeks following the debate saw the story of Kennedy's triumph ripple through the corridors of power in Washington. The headlines had faded, but the underlying message remained. Kennedy's words had not only struck down AOC's attempt to undermine his experience, they had sparked a deeper conversation about the role of wisdom in leadership. The debate wasn't just a momentary clash of two politicians. It was a microcosm of the broader tension between the old and the new in American politics. For Kennedy, the aftermath was both humbling and affirming. Despite the media frenzy, he had returned to his daily routine, answering calls, reading bills, and meeting with constituents. But there was an undeniable shift in how he was viewed even by his political allies. Many had seen him as a figure who had become somewhat of a political relic, a member of the establishment whose time had come and gone. But after that one moment on stage, he was a renewed force, a man who had proven that experience was not a weakness, it was a strength. In private conversations, Kennedy's colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, reached out to him with newfound respect. Some told him they had never thought of experience in the same light before. Others confided that they too had underestimated the value of measured responses and the kind of leadership that came from having lived through political battles, not just studied them. Kennedy had spent decades in the Senate, navigating the ups and downs of politics. He had seen laws passed, overturned, and debated, and through it all he had learned to listen, to weigh options carefully, and to understand the complexities of making decisions that affected real lives. AOC, on the other hand, had become a symbol of change, but her vision was often more immediate, more about breaking free from the constraints of the past than understanding how the past had shaped the present. Kennedy had shown that change didn't always mean rejecting the past. Sometimes it meant respecting it and using it to inform future decisions. As for AOC, the defeat had stung. She wasn't accustomed to losing, not in such a public, undeniable way. She had built her brand on being the outsider, the underdog, the voice of a generation that was tired of waiting for the old guard to get out of the way. But Kennedy's one-liner had shattered that narrative. She had been rendered powerless not by the content of her ideas, but by her failure to understand the depth of his experience and the strength that came with it. But AOC, like any true politician, knew how to pivot. She didn't dwell on her defeat for long. Instead, she used it as fuel to push her agenda forward. It wasn't just about her now. It was about proving that the next generation had something to offer, that her vision for America could transcend the limitations that Kennedy represented. In the months that followed, AOC began to incorporate more nuanced approaches into her speeches and policies. She started to publicly acknowledge the importance of working across generational lines, of understanding the value of experience, while also pushing for the kind of radical change she had championed. She still clashed with the establishment, but she did so with a newfound respect for the lessons of history. In her more reflective moments, she even acknowledged that Kennedy's words had given her a new perspective on leadership. And while she would never stop challenging the system, she had come to realize that the system itself was often built on the backs of those who had lived through the trials of governance. For Kennedy, the aftermath of the debate wasn't just about personal victory. He had won, yes, but in his heart, he knew that his real mission was to restore faith in the power of experience, to show that wisdom was not something to be mocked or discarded in a world that valued speed and novelty. He had shown that real change came from understanding the long view, from having the patience to wait for the right moment, and from being grounded in a history that was far older than any political movement or social media trend. Months later, at a town hall meeting in Baton Rouge, Kennedy found himself standing before a packed room of constituents answering questions, sharing ideas, and listening to their concerns. The debate with AOC had long been a topic of discussion, but it had since become less about the clash and more about what it represented. The crowd respected him for his quiet resolve, his ability to weather the storm of public scrutiny, and his consistent commitment to serving them. Kennedy didn't need flashy moments to win their trust. He needed only to continue doing the work, day after day, with integrity and dedication. It wasn't that Kennedy had won the debate and moved on. No, it was more than that. He had shifted the conversation. His words, simple and measured, had forced people to reconsider their assumptions about leadership. He had shown that change didn't have to come at the cost of wisdom. It could come from building on the lessons of the past, adapting them to the challenges of the present, and passing them on to future generations. Kennedy's success wasn't just a victory for him personally. It was a victory for the kind of politics that valued thoughtful leadership over quick fixes. He had crushed AOC's challenge not by overwhelming her with superior arguments or flashy rhetoric, but by being who he was, a man who had lived through the trials of politics, who had weathered the storms, and who understood that real power came from the ability to stay grounded in the face of change. AOC, in the end, found her own way to adapt. She didn't let Kennedy's words define her future. Instead, she used them as a stepping stone. She knew that the world needed both the wisdom of the past and the energy of the future to move forward. And while Kennedy's victory was a powerful reminder of the value of experience, AOC's determination to push for a better future kept her fighting, even if it meant sometimes taking a step back to learn, to reflect, and to grow. Together, Kennedy and AOC represented two sides of the same coin, one rooted in the past, the other reaching for the future. But in the end, their encounter had shown the world that the best way to shape the future was to honor the past, to learn from it, and to build upon it with purpose. And as the political landscape continued to evolve, one thing remained clear. Wisdom and experience, though often overlooked, would always find a way to make their presence known, even in the most unexpected ways.